This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 440, The Cost of Drupal. This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. On today's show, we are talking about the cost around Drupal, common misconceptions, and how you get what you pay for with guest Jeff Robbins. We'll also cover module instructions as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Jeff Robbins, the Lullabot guy, the ViibBox guy, the Orbit guy. Jeff, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
I didn't know you'd be reading that out. If I would have written something more elegant. I had 5 seconds before the show. Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff.
I appreciate short and sweet, so not a problem.
I've been many different guys over the course of my life, and different people at different times. Yes.
I'm Nick Lapham, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are, for his final week, Ivan Stegic, CEO of 10-7. Welcome back to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here again, fourth and final time. I'm hoping you guys invite me back at some point.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You can come back anytime.
Yeah, definitely get an invitation. Also joining us, as usual, John Picozzi, Solution Architect at EPAM.
Hello.
Hello, John.
Hey, everybody.
You need a live audience. I'm sorry, I don't mean to come on your podcast and tell you how to do things, but have you thought of having an applause track? I think John deserves a round of applause.
Or like a boo track, like, hello, everyone. Boo! Boo! You stink! Oh.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever wanted to have easy access to the README, changelog, and install files for the contrib modules on your Drupal site? There's a module for that. It's called Module Instructions, and it was created in April of 2012 by Alice Rebeck of Slovenia. It currently has 7.x-1.0 and 2.0.3 versions available, the latter of which works with Drupal 9 and 10. It is actively maintained and has security coverage. It also has test coverage, and it currently has 4 open issues, none of which are bugs against the 2.0 branch, which is great considering it's in use by over 1,200 Drupal sites, according to Drupal.org. The current maintainer of the 2.0 branch is Victor Polevicek, aka Austin Victor, of the Ukraine Drupal community. And the module works by, it's pretty straightforward. You essentially install the module the way you would any other, and then once it's installed, anyone who has access to the modules page on a Drupal site will see the links on that page for any README, changelog, or install files that are available for the contrib modules in the code base. It also provides a cron job and drush command to generate those links stored in the site state storage so that the application isn't doing all of the work of sort of parsing through your file system to find all of those different files within your contrib modules every time someone wants to load that modules page. It does override the template for the module page to add those links, so be aware that if you're doing something very custom and have overridden that template in something like a custom admin theme, you may need to manually add some markup in order to see those links. The module does also define new permissions to manage the settings for these links or to view them. And the settings really consist of specifying which of the links you want to appear if the relevant files are available. By default, it will show all 3, but if you wanted, you could, for example, only have it show the README links. So let's talk about module instructions.
Just out of curiosity, where can we find the module instructions for this module? No,
but once you install it,
that was a joke. It was a joke. It was a joke. Don't warrant that with an answer. This seems like a really good module to have, because like often you're like, you install a new module and you're like, how do I configure this thing? And then you're like, oh, let me go into the code. And then you're like, oh, let me go to Drupal.org. Let me, figure it out. Right. And adding those links right to like that page seems pretty smart. So this feels like a good one to me.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like it was a big step forward when Drupal added those like configuration and permissions links on the module page. So having these extra links to me feels like a natural progression there.
Yeah, absolutely. I would be interested to know how many modules. Obviously most modules have a README, but I wonder how many modules have like changelog or install files associated with them.
Yeah, I feel like to your point, John, README is pretty common, hopefully almost universal at this point, but changelog I definitely see less, in install I would say pretty rarely at this point.
Yeah.
Is there an actual like naming convention instructions? I haven't developed a Drupal module in quite a while, although I did develop a lot of them back in the day. Is there instructions for developers, guidance as to the naming of those files, or is this module just sort of making several educated guesses?
I don't think there's a specific guideline. I think in general, READMEs are almost always README, although I think this module is expecting them to be called readme.txt, and I think a lot of people are starting to move to readme.md.
Yeah.
Wait, there aren't core guidelines on what those files are called?
Yeah, it's README and install, but it does do some checking. Oh no, it does. Actually, I just read the code. It checks to see if there's a README TXT first, and if not, it looks for a README without a TXT suffix, and then it checks for lowercase. So it does some checking, but it's not. There's probably some that it could miss.
Yeah, I know there is a page in the Drupal core documentation that talks about README files and what the sort of canonical structure is meant to be and all those good things. So I imagine there's got to be some guidance in there in terms of how it should be named. But I feel like either readme.txt or readme.md is probably mostly what you're going to see.
Well, and then when a module like this gets popular, it starts to create its own
incentive
path. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, people sort of fall in line to be compatible with. So good stuff.
Yeah, Drupal.org also has a new integration with README to you can have it automatically copy the README text to the module page too. So you don't have to like update your README and then go into the module edit page and put it there. You can just check a box and it will
according to Drupal.org, and this is in the show notes, the readme.md template last updated on November 30th, 2023. The Drupal community recommends using the markdown format to create a readme.md file. The show notes will have a link to that if anybody's interested in reading more about readme files.
Awesome. Well, as always, thank you, Martin, for another great module of the week, and it's good to have you back this week.
Thanks, Nick. If our listeners want to suggest a module of the week, they can reach out to me on all the Drupal platforms as Manclue, or happy to also receive nominations in the Talking Drupal channel of the Drupal Slack.
Thanks. See you next week.
Bye.
Woo! Just saying.
Lots of energy this episode. I'm loving it.
Yeah, I love it.
Sorry.
No. We appreciate it. We appreciate it. This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. Let's talk about life after Drupal 7 end of life. Since August 2023, there's been a lot of discussion around Drupal 7's official end of life in January of 2025. It's no secret that many companies, organizations, and individuals are still on Drupal 7 and have yet to migrate. I think we can all agree that migration, while beneficial, is not always feasible, and this is where Hero Devs comes in. Hero Devs has partnered with core team maintainers of Drupal 7 to build and maintain the Drupal 7 never-ending support product, ensuring the same quality of support you have come to expect over the years. Drupal 7 never-ending support, or NES, allows for an effortless transition, allowing your site to remain secure, compliant, and compatible after Drupal 7 goes end of life. This allows you to migrate on your own time or potentially not at all. Hero Devs promises to keep Drupal 7 alive and well, even offering support for the current top 100 Drupal 7 modules. And if you'd like to know more about Drupal 7 never-ending support, visit herodevs.com. That's HERODEVS.com. Or you can listen to episode 439 of Talking Drupal to hear more directly from the CEO and CTO. Okay, now on to our primary topic. Okay, let's start with a non-Drupal question, Jeff. What are you up to these days? What have you been working on?
Well, to catch people up, if you think, oh, don't I know that guy from Lullabot or the Lullabot podcasts, which started back in 2006? So, hello, old person, you're old like me. I left Lullabot, exited in 2017, which was sort of a precursor to Lullabot becoming an employee-owned company, which it is now. And I started doing business coaching, and talking to other people who, like me, had started or were running businesses to help them better run their businesses, and from a bunch of different angles, and started posting articles and blog posts about that kind of thing on my website, jjeff.com. So if you're interested in finding out more about either of those things, business coaching or my thoughts about running a business, jjeff.com. And then kind of when the other thing that I did, so if you don't know, prior to running Lullabot, I had a career as a professional musician. I was in a band that was signed in the 90s. That band was called Orbit, hence the phrase the Orbit guy, the Lullabot guy, the Orbit guy. And it was difficult to be doing that while also being the CEO of a 65-person web development agency. And so I started a new band and kind of got back into that whole thing. And one of the things that we were doing with my new band was doing this projecting videos behind us while we played. And I was thinking a lot around sort of on-stage audiovisual experiences, and thinking about particularly making that more accessible to emerging artists, up and coming bands, because, when you go see a big show at a big venue, if you go see Lady Gaga, there will be big screens up behind and it will be showing stuff that's happening on stage, or just sort of vibey kinds of things. But all that technology is available to, you can shoot and edit videos on your phone. Laptops can play 8K video, and you can get a video projector for cheap these days. And so I started developing software to control that, and it's called ViibBox, and you can find out more about ViibBox at spaceage.tv. And so that's kind of my main thing right now. I do the coaching a few days a week, and then I do development and product management around ViibBox, which is getting more and more popular, and we're getting some semi-famous people starting to use the software, and it's fun to talk to them. So
it's very varied. It's all really cool. I mean, I'm always fascinated when technologies become more accessible to a wider audience.
It's I mean, to some extent, that was our mission around starting Lullabot, was that Drupal at the time really wasn't accessible to a wider audience. And so, in an effort to try to kind of help get it out there, evangelize, but even more than that, empower people, we started doing a podcast, we started doing workshops, and then we started doing consulting with, larger companies to help them sort of figure out how to harness the power of Drupal. And I'd like to think I'm sort of doing a similar kind of thing with ViibBox, in, kind of bringing all these things that have, there's clearly a lot of Venn diagram overlap between audio and video, but MTV isn't even really showing music videos these days anymore. There's just not a lot of people sort of exploring that intersection, particularly.
Before we jump into more about Lullabot and your kind of history with Drupal, ViibBox, is that matching the music to the video? Is that the idea there?
Basically, I'll speak technically because you're technical people. This is music tech stuff. So we're using MIDI to control videos, basically to be able to live edit a music video on stage as the band plays. So if you've got a jam band and you're not sure if how fast we're going to play the song tonight, or if the bridge is going to be 30 seconds or 3 minutes or 30 minutes, and so you can just loop things, you can kind of control the video in time with the music. Or if you do perform with a click track, as a lot of people currently, because a lot of the sort of visuals on stage stuff is happening around like EDM, particularly when there's not like, you've got a group like, I don't know, Daft Punk, where, it's interesting music and there's a lot of kinetic energy around it, but to look at the band on stage is kind of static. And so, a lot of EDM has visual stuff around it. This doesn't tend to happen as much around more organic versions of music, partly because you oftentimes need to play with a click track in order to be able to sync it up. This allows you to sync it up without playing with a click track. If you are playing with a click track, it's kind of already synced up, and so it'll work with that too. So
man, it sounds like we need to have a whole show just about this.
Yeah. It's
that's what this was. Oh,
I have dug deep. In this is what I'm thinking about these days, is this sort of thinking about video as music, sort of the rhythm of visuals and the even sort of synthesis of visuals, sort of these concepts in music synthesis of like attack, decay, sustain and release, and as it relates to what's happening visually on the screen. You have something like a bomb going off, or sort of these things that are kind of percussive, as opposed to more paddy ambient kinds of things that just sort of stay on the screen. So
I have a question. Yeah, we have one more before we move on. I have a question. Have you considered like the modular synth community then? Because I mean, connecting that to, I have a couple of modular synths on my desk right now. I tinker with, and I feel like tying into that community is, I mean, it's a cool community, and giving them the ability to kind of tie their music into something visual is. There is certainly some overlap, and we have a lot of modular synth type people who found ViibBox and are using it in performing and stuff. It's the other thing about it is that there are some like VJ tools that are out there, particularly established ones that are very technical and also very expensive. And so ViibBox is sort of designed to be kind of the garage band of that, kind of the on-ramp easy thing for people. So some of those people are, want to do live coding on stage, and ViibBox doesn't really do that. But if you want to, shoot things on your phone or just quickly create an immersive live show, that's what it does. Spaceage.tv. I'll keep plugging it.
Nerd Summit this past year, they did they did a keynote about kind of like coding music and like coding visuals to go with music. And it's very reminiscent of that.
I also want to take a moment to appreciate this is episode number 440. It's a perfect A. The frequency that we tune to make sure that we're all in tune together. So I'm appreciating that.
Man.
To get even more geeky about it, let's do it. Let's get geeky. I said I was going to take this podcast off the rails. So ViibBox is built using Electron. Are you guys familiar with Electron?
Yeah. When is it going to be on Linux then? I mean,
we will get there. We're not supporting it officially currently. But for listeners who don't know, Electron, which you can find, I think it's electron.org, is a framework for building desktop apps, Windows, Mac, and, as Nick is alluding, Linux apps, using basically web technologies. It bundles a version of the Chromium engine along with usually Node.js based JavaScript and HTML and CSS to create a desktop web app that uses HTML and CSS as its rendering layer, but using all that node stuff that you think like, oh, I guess you could access files and do things like that. But there's also, because we're bundling Chrome with it, we don't need to worry about cross-browser compatibility because we know exactly which browser is going to be running our code, which means we can get deep into like the MIDI API and audio API and WebGL and WebGPU and all that kind of stuff to really kind of do a lot of stuff that you kind of wouldn't think about doing with a conventional web app where you're downloading the media from a server because, you need to wait for it to download. But when it's all local, you could do some crazy stuff. And that's what we're doing. So anyways, if anybody's interested in helping with development, we're always looking for development help. So reach out about that too.
I think we should definitely have a show about that in the future. We'll bring you back. We'll talk about that in more specific, because I have a ton more questions, but I want to focus back on, today's topic, the cost of Drupal. But first I want to remind folks, because you just talked about a lot of cool music stuff that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Drupal. But you have a long history in Drupal, and I want to remind listeners of how that kind of started. You alluded to, obviously starting Lullabot back in the day, but can you give us a brief history of how you got started with Drupal?
Yes. I mean, some of my history with Drupal, it's like, so I've been a web developer since the beginning of the web. I helped work on the first commercial website when I was working at O'Reilly in 1992. My wife is the first commercial web designer. She was the designer for that project, and has since written several books about web design for O'Reilly. And then that was the early 90s. My band got signed in 1993, and I spent the remainder of the 90s in a tour van. But I kept up with a lot of my friends who were building kind of big name web things, and got back into web development when my band got dropped in the early aughts, and eventually started building bigger and bigger websites. My wife and I ran ringostar.com for a number of years. And through that, we kind of got opportunities to build bigger, kind of beefier websites. And so I was looking for something to manage the content, right? It was more than a blog, but less than a full-fledged e-commerce website. It had all these sort of different aspects of community and stuff like that. And so I started asking around some of my web friends about what they knew. I downloaded Plone. I downloaded Mambo.
Whoa.
I know. This is what I said.
Blast from the past.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
And
Python,
I'm
right?
reading these manuals going like, okay, I just got to get my head around this. And I talked to my friend Jeff Veen, who has had several different careers in the web community, and he at the time he had a pretty popular blog, and I was complaining about how they all had different terms for things, and like there was like Plone had its way of referring to things, and Mambo at the time had Mombots was the way that you like automate. And I'm like I get about halfway through the manual and go like, screw this, this is ridiculous, I can't do this. And so Jeff wrote an article on his blog based on our conversation, and Dries and several other people from the Drupal community came and said, we want Drupal to be this. We want Drupal to be easy to use. We want it to be better. We want it to be good. And so I went and downloaded Drupal, and at first I was like, this isn't beautiful. This is like, it was very stark and simple, and the design stuff was not really up to speed. But I opened up the code and I could read it. Like there were lots of comments. There was it was very linear, waterfall style PHP, a functional PHP, and and the idea that the community wanted it to be better was nice. And so I started kind of developing my project with Drupal, participated a lot in the IRC channels and got slapped down a lot by a lot of developers, just with links off to php.net or mysql.com or whatever what the websites are for things. But and it hurt, but I kept pushing through, thinking like, first of all, I just need to do this project, and just trying not to have a lot of ego around it. And so eventually I found a guy named Matt Westgate who seemed to know everything there was to know around Drupal. He developed the e-commerce package that that I was using in my project. I got him on the phone. I said, I have this crazy idea. I've done the math. If I could just talk to you on the phone and pay you for your time, it would be cheaper than me having to learn all of this stuff myself. And so I just got him on the phone for this crazy idea that we called consulting. And he helped me become a Drupal expert. And the whole time I'm saying that you don't understand. Like, this is really important information. People need to know this. I said, we should start a company. We should start a company. Like, I know people, I know marketing, I know how to put up posters for bands, and like, I know how to make t-shirts. Like, let's start a company and we'll make it sound like a band. It'll sound like a techno band because we're doing technical stuff. So we'll call it Lullabot. That sounds like a techno act. And that's how Lullabot got started. That we started it that way. And
where did you put the first poster for Lullabot?
Well, probably at the first DrupalCon that we went to. I mean, we certainly had stickers and T-shirts and all that kind of stuff, yeah, that was my goal. I would come up with different names that I thought would be a good name for the company, but I would also do like a logo treatment for Matt, send it to him. Like, I wanted a whole thing that was like here, Lullabot, and then have this red robot, and that'll be our thing, like this kind of Zen robot. So yeah. That's how Lullabot got started. And that was 2006. January 1st, 2006 is when we launched lullabot.com. And very quickly we picked up some really big kind of household name projects. We have pictures of ourselves. We launched in January. I think there was some sort of a Drupal event. I want to say it was in Vancouver that we went to like in February. And several people came up and said, "Oh, you guys are doing cool stuff. Are you hiring?" And we're like, and then in March we got the opportunity to do MTV in London. We flew out to London and started working with MTV to build mtv.co.uk. We got the Lifetime television website, and those were kind of, there was a lot to be proud of with Drupal, but it had yet to really kind of find household name websites. And early the next year we started working with Sony Music and helped them build their artist platform. And I won't go through the complete Lullabot portfolio, but was good stuff. I mean, as successful as I had felt playing in a band for a living for most of the 90s, this was like we could bring on employees and like build a company, which we did. It was like, oh, this is actually success. This just feel like success. So that was really nice.
And as Jeff mentioned earlier, Lullabot is now an employee-owned company, which you can actually listen to Talking Drupal 390 with Seth Brown, where he talks all about that.
Yep.
So
yeah, it was a great solution to sort of the issue that a lot of company founders have of starting a company and kind of seeing it through to a certain point, and then kind of getting into this kind of maintenance mode, which is fine for some people, but I'm a starter. I like to solve big problems, and Lullabot had sort of gotten through a lot of those big struggles, and I wasn't spinning my wheels, but I wasn't being my most effective. And so, and I talk to people, this is in my coaching work, I talk to people all the time that, this sort of like, what do? I don't want to like sell my company and give it up to some random buyer, kind of sell it to the highest bidder, and becoming an ESOP, which is the technical word, the employee stock option program, or stock ownership.
Stock ownership.
That's stock ownership.
Stock
That's it.
ownership, yeah.
Yes. It's not options. It's ownership. And so by doing that, basically the employees of Lullabot became the owners, and that's still the case. If you get a job at Lullabot, you immediately become an owner of the company and have say as a shareholder. And it's a really interesting system that is very egalitarian. Good stuff.
So you talked about a number of larger clients and portfolio items that Lullabot has, and that was really early on in Lullabot's career, your career. And we've talked about how sometimes it's really hard to sell Drupal because it turns out to be expensive in some cases. And I think like you've alluded to the idea that these big companies are paying big money for big complex things. And that complexity is expensive. What's your take on that? Is that true?
Yeah, hard things are hard. It's also hard to make things easy. But when you're solving a narrower problem set, and so, this is the thing I used to say, and I don't know if it still quite applies, but WordPress was designed as a blogging platform. At its core, it is a blogging platform. Drupal was designed as a content management system, right? We're talking a single value variable or a multi-valuable array variable, right? Like one has one thing, a blog, and the other has everything. We're going to make YouTube with it. We're going to make Netflix with it. We're going to make, Facebook with it. You should be able to do everything. And that's much more complex a problem to solve. And so some of Drupal's complexity comes from having that at its heart, this sort of idea of needing to be a flexible way to do everything rather than the WordPress advantage. Honestly, it's a bit of an advantage to be able to say, well, let's just solve blogging. Let's just solve that and make it easy. And then maybe we'll add some add-ons. You could also do e-commerce somehow, and so it's, particularly with those two platforms, it's been a bit of a tortoise in the hare race a little bit, because Drupal was slow to include some like very common things like image handling, like I want to just have an image in my blog post, and was like, well, Drupal was like 10 years old and we're like, I don't know if we want to let you upload an image, It's like, but it was mostly due to the complexity of like, what does it mean to have an image, and manage that. So yes, more complex. Likewise, to kind of bring this back to the commerce, or to the cost of Drupal, you get a proprietary platform like Squarespace or Wix, and they're solving the 85% problem, right? What do 85% of people need with a website, and how can we kind of simplify that problem? That, is at least a finite problem set. I wouldn't say it's easy, but it is a finite problem set. It's difficult to make easy, but it's a finite problem set. Drupal is really focused on that remaining 15%. And so it can be shocking sometimes to say, okay, I had a kid at my son's high school build me a Squarespace website, and I'm paying $20 a month for it now, but I wanted to also have a community section and an e-commerce area and be able to send out emails and ... I've heard Drupal's good. I call Yvonne and I say, hey, how much would it cost to get this this website in Drupal? And it's $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 rather than $20 a month, so expensive, like, but you could do anything with it, and you can kind of build your own custom solutions. You could build Facebook with it, which is what people wanted to do for a while,
for a long time.
And that's kind of the I don't know, cost benefit analysis, right, of Drupal is like, what do you need it to do, right? Do you need it to connect all your disparate systems and send emails and let your users log in and let them buy things and let them have an account that they can keep, images on and like X, Y, Z to infinity and beyond, right? Or do you just need it to do kind of what Squarespace does, right? It's, a web platform. It's got integrated hosting. It has an e-commerce solution you can bring into it. You could bring MailChimp in for emails, right? And that's like a smaller footprint. You have to kind of work within their sandbox of like features, right? So, I think like people have to do that to figure out which path to go down. One question I have as a follow-up to what Yvonne just asked is, lately, I think we've been hearing with, Drupal 7 becoming end of life, and like, Drupal 10 kind of rising, if you will, that, Drupal is becoming more of an enterprise-only solution, right? And I'm wondering, Jeff, because you've seen Drupal, from end to end, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you believe that.
It is open source software. It is free software. Let's not forget that. So there will be friends of your kid at high school who will want to learn Drupal and will build you a Drupal site for free or cheap, and that is within the realm of possibilities. But for the most part, Drupal as a complex system needs some managing. It needs some expertise. It needs some knowledge. Just simply the art of knowing which modules to choose and how to configure them, and some of the common pitfalls that you guys probably talk about on this podcast all the time. I mean, back in the day, we were like, enable caching. You have to enable page caching, and,
Yes.
this is, way before we were talking about edge hosting and, things like that. So, it's a complex system that can be done badly. And so some expertise is required and experts are expensive, but it is more flexible. I think it's not a bad thing necessarily. One of the things about my coaching work is I get to talk to people from all over, and different people running different types of companies from a wide variety. And the Drupal ecosystem is generally pretty good, partly because it is a lot of larger institutions and larger enterprise companies that have money to spend and are willing to take the timelines and do it right. Whereas WordPress has always kind of struggled with a lot of like, there are a lot of cottage industry, mom and pop, little shops. There are several larger, WordPress companies, but the majority of that ecosystem, historically at least, has been these smaller companies that are, kind of, you can get a website for $10,000 to $20,000 on WordPress, but it's not going to do what you can do with Drupal.
And the other big thing that it doesn't do is it doesn't have the communication between the ecosystems, right? When you're making a decision in WordPress, you choose a form module. It might not communicate with the e-commerce module. Web form and e-commerce don't typically speak to each other, but it's more stark in WordPress. How much do you think some of this cost is due to Drupal as a framework being more complex to handle those cases versus just the complexity of the projects that lend themselves to Drupal, right? If you have, like you said, if you have that simple finite problem, it's going to just take less effort. So when you're looking at a Drupal specific project nowadays, is it more expensive because the project is inherently more complex? And how much of that is the technology?
So let me just step back from this question for a moment and say, this conversation that we're having now, we've been having since 2006 at least, right? Drupal has historically been the more expensive solution, and I am super empathetic to wanting things to be cheaper. And Seth at Lullabot and I have had this conversation all the time. Like, what would it take to make $10,000 Drupal websites, $5,000 Drupal websites, and it always kind of comes back around to like, I don't know if that's the business I want to be in, would you rather have one $100,000 project or $25,000 projects with all of those $5,000 clients who are kind of novice, so I'm skirting around your question a little bit, but lots of times what you find is institutions, universities, governments, whoever, museums, standardizing on a platform, and then it becomes more cost effective for them to be plugging in, hey, we need to roll out a new Drupal website, hey, we need to roll out these new features. The other thing that we find a lot is Lullabot did a lot of work in the media space. NBC was one of our big clients. We were in the Grammys website for years, and a lot of those things, there's like on online other systems that you need to tie into, like we need to show the TV schedule, like what's coming up at the top of the hour, what's the next television show, or what, that kind of stuff. And so there's the other thing with Drupal is this sort of deep integration into deep integration, right? And yeah, exactly. And so it becomes the solution when you're out of solutions.
I have two quick follow-ups, because I just want to really quickly comment that when we're saying it's more expensive, and feel free to correct me if I misspeak here, it's more expensive when compared to other open source projects because it has that depth of complexity. But if you're comparing implementing Drupal versus implementing like SharePoint or Adobe's product or something,
absolutely, and
Drupal's
historically,
Drupal.
And in 2006, we were it was like Vignette, and it was we had clients that were paying literally like just their license fee for Vignette for their website was $2 million a year, and we're like, you could hire so many Drupal developers for that money, like here's what, let's build you the website, and set you up with a team of 3 developers, and you run your own website, you're self-contained, and maybe it would be nice if you participated in the Drupal community and gave back some of your code, and that was an easier sell than that solution at the time. So
and the other thing is, I think Drupal is going through a cycle. I think it's got a long-term cycle, and it's definitely on the developer experience end, but Drupal, early days, Drupal 7, when there weren't any Squarespaces, you could build a $5,000 or $1,000 Drupal 7 site if it was a marketing site, a couple pages, something like that.
Not with nowadays, John's not going to build that website. For people that are listening to the audio podcast, John's making a face right now.
And nowadays, Drupal 8, I think a lot, 9 and 10, very much pivoted towards, I don't want to say enterprise, but the more complex use case, because that was where, like you said, the 15%, that's where it was going. But there's definitely a couple of initiatives like recipes and easy out of the box and automatic updates and things that once those all land in core, you're probably still not going to easily get somebody just coming from no knowledge and setting up a Drupal site for that cost. But I think it will really enable, again, this is future prediction, so who knows if this comes true, but I think it will enable some companies from providing Drupal sites almost as a service, where it's like you have a couple of options, you pick them, we apply a recipe, we customize a couple variables to change the theme a little bit and give you some flexibility, and now you have a straightforward, fairly custom looking website without, and all of the effort was invested upstream for that. So I think we're starting to get back to the side of things where we make it a little bit easier for the users and builders, and we've spent the last, 7 or 8 years really hardcore pushing on making the developer experience second to none.
Yeah, but sometimes the user experience suffers a little bit for that, he says lightly. user experience is kind of the opposite of developer experience. Sometimes developer experience is about flexibility, clarity. Certainly there's a lot to clarity and making it kind of providing some rails, no pun intended, for development. But user experience, and I know this because this is the whole focus of ViibBox, my project now, is about dogma, right? It's about choosing a use case, that 85% use case, and focusing on it and guarding it, right? From complexity, from just confusion, and so you could build Squarespace with Drupal. You could. Like I joke about, build this with that, build this with Drupal, but you could, and there could be a distribution that's come build your website, in this thing that's running on our server, which happens to be Drupal. And this is actually a project that Lullabot did some work into a while back, kind of looking into starting up something that would have been a competitor to Wix or Squarespace. But yeah,
that's what Drupal Gardens was for a while, though, right?
Yep.
And maybe the timing was wrong on that. Like Wix and
I'm
Squarespace were like...
I'm contractually prevented from commenting. No, there's no contract. There's no contract. Okay. but I won't comment.
So many thoughts, right? We come into Drupal projects a lot of the times, and I think Nick's question, right, of how does the design time and the maintenance and the information architecture, right, contribute to the cost of a Drupal project? And I think there's a lot of people that don't realize that all of that stuff is going to happen regardless of if it's Drupal or not, right? Nick had asked if it was the technology, and I think we've all been doing this long enough where we've seen that more cost has been incurred because of bad information architecture.
Yep.
The reliance on custom modules as opposed to using out of the box modules, which I sometimes tag to people coming in and just saying, oh, you want a Drupal site? Okay, I'm going to do it. And I don't really know anything about Drupal. Right. And those aspects can make Drupal more expensive in the long haul. But overall, you do have maintenance costs with a regular website. You do have design costs, because unless you're taking an off the shelf theme and just applying it, right? So I kind of struggle, and obviously I'm a Drupal fanboy. So grain of salt, but there was a point in time where I realized, and this was, Nick and I are gonna have to talk offline of how or when he was able to charge $1,000 or $5,000 for a Drupal site and then build it, because that to me blows my mind. But anyway, I don't want to.
That's how you learn Drupal. You charge people way too little money.
So there was a point in time where I had that logic. I was like, everything's going to be a Drupal site because Drupal is amazing, right? And it was maybe right around the Drupal 6, Drupal 7 timeframe, right? But at some point, I got to the point where I'm like, oh, this person needs a website. I'm like, okay, what's the criteria? Oh, you just need a website. You just need to be able to sell your wares online or whatever the minimal criteria is. I'm like, oh, Squarespace sounds like a great solution for you. Hosting is included. As Jeff said, it's $20 a month or $100 a year, whatever it is. And boom, you have a whole platform that doesn't involve much stuff, right?
Yeah.
Drupal sometimes gets a bad rap, right? Because it's not the technology. As Jeff said, it's free open source software. What you end up paying for and where the value comes in is the experience to implement it correctly. And then all of the other stuff, right, that you get from it, as far as hey, it does a lot of things out of the box for you that you don't have to do yourself. But also the other expenses is not necessarily related to Drupal. It's in design, it's in information architecture, it's in having conversations around strategy, right?
I agree with that. Yeah, I'm going to jump in before Jeff can say anything here, but
I was just going to say good things about you, Yvonne.
Oh, okay. Well,
In
It's a trap.
I've
trap.
stumped you. So because Drupal is sort of a higher hurdle, you get better developers, but you also get better customer service, customer support people, client account people, better, like Yvonne's company has all this experience around building and talking to clients. Like, how do you help them solve their problems above and beyond just the Drupal problem is only one of the problems.
Part of it.
And,
Mhm.
and a bigger problem oftentimes is translating what their hopes and dreams are into what they'll be happy with, which is oftentimes not
And
quite the same.
often sometimes, Ivan, I'm sure you may or may not agree with this, so you can chime in, but like often the problem that you're helping them solve isn't necessarily a Drupal problem, right? Drupal can be part of it, right?
Right.
But it's not that. That's not the
100%.
problem.
Right.
I-
Have you
100%.
thought
It's
about
like
sending out
technology.
postcards?
Yeah, right. Like, is technology the problem? Most often the answer to that is no. It's a human problem. It's usually something that we're solving that has flesh and blood, that is trying to figure something out. And the technology that you use to solve it is almost irrelevant sometimes. And the
Unless
more
it's
complex
implemented,
the problem is,
unless it's implemented poorly or incorrectly, right?
right,
Well,
unless there's a bunch of technical debt.
I'm realizing something as we're talking too, and I've been wondering for this whole time why Drupal has that reputation of being expensive, especially when it's working on more complex stuff. And I'm realizing I think one of the reasons is Drupal front loads a fair amount of the cost. So if you're comparing a WordPress site and a Drupal site, and they end up in the same really complex place, Drupal is going to take a little bit more to get off the ground, but that graph is going to be, the slope is going to be a lot lower. So, as complexity increases, costs increase, but it's not that much. When you get to WordPress, at some point, the cost just goes vertical, right? At some point, you're rewriting entire sections of WordPress
Just
core.
huge amounts of
just get it to work.
technical debt
And it's
in core, not in the platform you're using, not in your own custom code. Because it's one thing to have technical debt in your own custom code that you have to refactor. It's another thing when the platform you're using doesn't even have the ability to say like, hey, my plugin depends on this other plugin. Make sure it's available and installed before you try to install me. Whereas
Nick,
Drupal's had that solved since 2005.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, right? Like you come to Drupal, right? And there's cost. You're paying for that cost of expertise, right? You that cost of being in the ecosystem, right? And I think what you see there, you're absolutely right, is like out of the box, Drupal does a lot of great things that save you money. If you implemented another solution, you may have to custom build, custom develop. You might have to like link some things together. That all takes time and energy, right? I think what you get out of Drupal, you get out of the box functionality, right? You also get a module ecosystem that can get you to a place a lot faster. I was, as I mentioned in our pre-show, right? I had somebody come to me. They asked me about, implementing something. They were going to write a service, and I was like, well, what if we used ECA, or what if we used some other modules in the ecosystem? And they're like, all right, let me take a look at that. And like now that expertise has come in and that suggestion has been made, now they're staying closer to Drupal core. They're staying closer to modules that are supported by the community. And as Nick was alluding to earlier, staying closer to Drupal core now gives you a path to Drupal 10, Drupal 11, Drupal 12, and an easy upgrade path to be able to kind of enhance your platform going forward, right? So now there's this whole idea in the Drupal sphere of like, hey, you're not rebuilding your website every 3 years. You might reskin it, sure, but like now it's almost saving you money because you're still paying maintenance costs. You're still paying to do feature improvements, but you're not paying that big bang price tag every 3 years to rebuild your website.
Yeah.
What you're describing is the effects of the very long-term investment we've been making in documentation, in security, in accessibility, in translation, in moving all of these things to core, and what we're not going to see in the future are these huge capital investments of upgrades between 7 and 8 or 6 and 7, and now we'll just continue to see these incremental changes. And I personally think that's a huge amount of value that Drupal has. And I'm kind of curious to hear, like, how does that compare to other platforms out there? Like you know, Nick, you talked about this vertical lift that WordPress will have, and that you have to start making all these changes to core just to get to the next level for whatever feature you needed there. Like, what other platform has this? Does WordPress doesn't? What does Jeff think?
Yeah.
Well,
He's our guest, right?
I'm just thinking, again, it goes to this architecture thing that Drupal is designed for the unknown. It's designed for the future. You know, it's it's designed. How can we implement best practices that are relatively future proof, that, you know, we won't paint ourselves into a corner? And yeah, it took a long time to get image handling in core, but it's good. It's flexible. It's well thought out, you know, I mean, all that kind of stuff. And I think that also sort of ripples out through even the Drupal ecosystem. Like, I know that a lot of these platforms, there are paid modules and plugins or whatever they're called, and they're essentially proprietary. So who knows how the security is? And, you know, and Drupal tends more towards, you know, it's probably the GPL license, because that is sort of infecting other things to be open and free, for better or for worse. But it means that we've got this, you know, Drupal.org with all this code that you can go through and see the issues that people have posted around it. If people find security problems, there are methods and practices around, you know, correcting those things. So you can be a little bit more, you have a little bit more peace of mind and a little bit more future proofedness, you know, at least in theory. And again, it's, you know, your mileage may vary, but that's the concept. So
yeah, and I think that, I mean, there's just so much that there's so much value that Drupal has, that being primarily a Drupal developer, I sometimes take for granted, to be honest. And you highlighted so much of it, but another specific example of this is the image handling system. You mentioned images earlier, which is why I bring this up. But Drupal now has for a long time, Drupal's had a really good system for setting presets. You know, for people that don't know, you know, you can upload an image and say, hey, if you use the image as a teaser, then it's going to be 400 by 400. If it's in the hero, it's going to be X by X, whatever. And you can have these different rules for the same image, and Drupal will automatically generate them on the fly. In more recent versions, you can now apply lazy loading by default in config, and you can set up responsive breakpoints. So you can, in configuration and in the UI, you can essentially say, hey, if this image is a teaser and the browser width is this, it should be 100 by 100, et cetera. You know, your picture element rules. And Drupal allows you to do that. I mean, it takes effort.
It's amazing.
I converted a Drupal project from using just flat images to using responsive images 18 months ago. And it took probably, I don't know, 15 hours of work. And a lot of that was really just getting really nitty gritty with the design client, trying to figure out what rules there should be. And it's a very large site. I have a WordPress project, and we're working on the same thing. And let me tell you, we're probably, first of all, WordPress does have picture elements and stuff, but they make way different assumptions. Whereas Drupal's assumption is like, hey, we have a framework where you can make these decisions and apply the best one for you. WordPress says, hey, by default, you just define what presets you want. And if the image is big enough to apply it, we'll grab it and we'll put it in the picture element. So if you define 10 different presets or 20 different presets, I mean, it's not unheard of to have a Drupal site with 35 presets, right? WordPress is going to take, when you upload an image, and generate 35 presets for that image, even if that particular image is only uses 2 of them or 3 of them. So I have spent a lot of time looking for plugins in WordPress, and they're all they either don't work with the version of WordPress we're on, or they haven't been updated in 10 years, or they just don't work. I've spent, I don't even know, 70 hours, 80 hours, basically trying to rebuild Drupal's image caching and image preset system. And it's been a significant investment for that client. They've spent a significant amount. In fact, I've spent so much time that I've considered trying to wrap it up in a nice little bow and providing it as a plugin to the community, because it solves a lot of the problems in the same way that Drupal does, and it's extremely valuable. But it's not something, it's not something that I, as a Drupal developer, have ever had to think about beyond the architect side of like, okay, which image, what sizes do I actually need? What's the right size? What's the most performant? Like that side of it, the implementation side. I have never had to write image caching code myself.
I want to give a shout out to Daryl O'Pry, who's been helping me with ViibBox. He's been my partner on the ViibBox project, and he wrote the original image cache module and the image handling that ended up making it into core, and still makes Drupal superior to WordPress, apparently.
Yeah, I really try to refrain from like we're better, because everything has a use case, and people have spent significant amount of time on each project, and WordPress does excel in some ways over Drupal, like in some. But I think, going back to my earlier point, like I think some of that initial setup cost is there, but it gives you the runway to, as you said, Jeff, like do the unknowable. I mean, it's a framework. It's going to take, but it's less of a framework than like Laravel. Like Laravel is even a lower level framework. Symfony, like you have to, like in Symfony, you have to define your own like field types,
right?
And define it. Whereas where Drupal has an interface for defining those.
Well, and there is an advantage to that dogma, right? Like, how do I do what do I do? And and being able to sort of have a multiple choice with Drupal from all these modules and kind of these patterns that people have followed in the past. Whereas, any kind of framework, even if you go to the conference where they're talking about how the framework was used to build a specific thing, they're not showing you the inner workings, right? Whereas Drupal's a little bit more building blocky, and it's the value of a podcast like this, right? Just listening to what the week's module is super helpful if you're a Drupal developer. Hearing you guys talk about how things, I tried this module and it's really cool. I tried this and it wasn't quite what I expected. And also, by the way, these two don't work together in the way that you would think they would. That's, as a Drupal developer, that's what you need to know. That's the value. So it can be confusing if someone's starting Drupal development at first to think that it is Drupal development, that it's ones and zeros, that it's coding. But there's so much about the community and knowing sort of the flow of the sociology of Drupal that becomes really important as well. So
okay, we got just a couple questions left, and this next one I'm going to rephrase a little bit. So the question is, what can we do to make Drupal more attractive and attainable for the larger population? But I guess the question is, does Drupal have to change to try to encompass more than just, again, we're just throwing out numbers. We said 15%, but does Drupal need to solve more than 15% of the problems? Does it need to become easier for less complex situations?
I'm sure Yvonne has thoughts about this, right? I mean, this is the frontline sales stuff. This is, when what is it that turns off people about Drupal when you're talking to them on the phone, Yvonne?
It's different things for different people. Smaller clients, smaller projects want it to be cheaper. Bigger clients want it to be faster. And I kind of like the way Nick reframed this question. And honestly, I think it's more along the lines of, do we need to be more cost effective? Because maybe the more cost effective thing isn't the right thing. Maybe it's not the right thing to use Drupal. Maybe you should be using a static site generator or WordPress. And so I like the thing that you said earlier as well, which is, it's open source. It's out there. We're not preventing you from using it. Like, if there's a freelancer that can meet your need, maybe that's okay. Maybe that's what you need to do. And maybe it's not about making it more attractive or more attainable for a larger community, a larger population. Maybe it's okay to just be the way we are.
I personally think we do need to expand it a little bit. I don't think we necessarily need to go back to like in Drupal 5, you would build a Drupal site for a plumber or for an electrician, you know, a 5-page site with a web form. Like, it made sense. The thing is, it Squarespace perfectly fits their use case. Like, it's hard.
Well, the competition's changed, the market's changed.
Yeah,
I mean, what was an acceptably designed website? You know, 960 pixels wide, right? What was like, you know, that's not what we do anymore.
Yeah, and so now I think it needs to expand for a different reason, though. And this is something we've been talking about for years on the podcast. I think one of the things that Drupal's been missing in the last few years is having an easier time starting sites from scratch is a good pipeline for new developers getting to the system. I mean, I started as a freelancer just building small little sites for way less than I should have been charging. But if the barrier to entry for Drupal had been as high as it is now, I don't know if I would have started with Drupal. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, I think it's a good way for some clients to organically get into Drupal, right? If they start a business and use Drupal to start their simple site, and then as it gets more complex, Drupal can grow organically with that company. Right now, where Drupal is, they kind of have to be a little bit over that complexity hurdle already, which makes that barrier to entry even higher. But like you guys have said a couple of times, it's open source. So if the community feels the need to move in a direction, the community will. And that's fine.
Right now, there are not a whole lot of financial motivators around making Drupal a lower common denominators. You know, and there could be, there should be, you know, that people should be out there applying for grants to make Drupal easier, to make it a lower common denominator, to make the Squarespace of open source. But the companies that are driving Drupal now are tended to be working on enterprise projects with enterprise clients.
Yep.
And so, you know, the motivators just aren't there. And I say that with the deepest amount of compassion and empathy towards people that want to be able to harness this power without having to invest this much money. But we need to kind of attack that at the source.
Yeah. And I think that to be honest, the Drupal Association under Tim Doyle, that's one of the things that they've been pivoting towards.
Yep.
Like, one of the 3 prongs is fundraising, and one of them is innovation, right? So I think that Drupal is starting to think strategically about those, because Drupal has done such a good job of solving so many of the developer-centric problems. I think it's looking for, what's next.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking forward to it. That's for sure.
Can I just ask a question about what the two of you think about this? I've thought for the longest time that we're in a place now as a Drupal community and as a product that we really don't need the version numbers anymore. We don't really need 10.1 in the marketing or 10.2 in the marketing. That when when 11 comes out, it's going to be a series of deprecations of frameworks that had an end of life that we knew about. We added some new features. It's not this big thing going from 6 to, as it was from 6 to 7, 7 to 8. When do we end up dropping the number? When is it just Drupal?
Maybe after Drupal. I mean, it can't until Drupal 7 goes away. But what do you think, Jeff?
I've
never thought about this, by the way.
Oh,
it's fascinating.
I've thought about it.
I've thought about this. I didn't know you did too, Jeff. This is interesting.
Okay, so help me here, because I've honestly not been paying a whole lot of attention to Drupal since the past few years. I've been really immersed in this world of TypeScript and Node and that kind of stuff. But was it Drupal 7 to Drupal 8? Was it Drupal 8 that got delayed, or was Drupal 7? No, it was Drupal 8, I think. And it was a big problem for people running agencies in the Drupal ecosystem, because
100%.
the Drupal Association and Acquia, maybe, I'm trying to remember, but basically there was this effort. Drupal, there were a lot of companies, several companies, one company in particular, that had really tied their cart to Drupal. And the progression of Drupal was closely related to their business. And so but the thing with open source, if anybody listening to this podcast doesn't know, at least in the way that the Drupal ecosystem has tended to work in the past, is it's the kindness of strangers. It's the people who work 8 hours a day coming home and working another 6 hours on Drupal to be part of the community and to be, to kind of do these Sudoku problems that are solving Drupal and to move it forward. However, the timeline for that is really hard to project manage, because these are not people who are paid. You can't crack the whip, and the ebb and flow of attention to a project may ebb and flow with the interest around Drupal or some new technology, with PHP or some new technology or things like that. Yeah. And so what was happening was Drupal 7 was out. It was the version that companies like mine were selling to customers. And people in the Drupal community started promoting Drupal 8 because they wanted to get developers excited about Drupal 8 and the possibilities of it's going to have all these new features. Everyone should focus on Drupal 8. And everyone in the Drupal community was hearing about this, including everyone's stakeholder customers, who would say, and we heard this over and over, and it nearly sunk the company. It sunk several companies in the Drupal ecosystem, of hey, we're going to hold off. We don't want to build a Drupal 7 website now because we've heard how great Drupal 8's going to be. When's that going to be out, by the way? We don't know. Maybe 6 months, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, maybe never. Well, we're going to just hold off. So we're not going to pay you guys. We'll just wait. And it was a real problem. So there's sort of three different factors at play here, which are the sort of commerce around companies who are honestly the lifeblood of the Drupal community, are these companies that are getting paid to do Drupal. And a lot of times the development that happens in Drupal is a side effect of that, right? It provides the commerce for people to do the either to do it as a paid project for a client and contribute it back to Drupal, or to just do it on the side, or whatever that is. And then there's marketing, and trying to market. This is the other two, is marketing of Drupal, and then there's kind of this marketing to Drupal developers to try to get people involved in the Drupal community. And those two things are kind of opposed to each other. The example I always use is it's different now because Photoshop and all the Adobe projects are really veered towards this subscription model. And this is part of the reason why that a lot of software is on this subscription model, because in the past, when a new version of Photoshop was coming out, you wouldn't hear about it a year ahead of time because people would stop buying Photoshop, right? Yeah. And so this is, like, version numbers are fine for commercial software when you kind of know, or there's sort of some clear timeline. But at least the way that Drupal's worked in the past, where it was sort of this thing, and now all the problems around Drupal 7, and people are stuck on Drupal 7. I mean, it sounds like there are some solutions that are emerging around that, but like, I see where this question comes from. Maybe there is a world in which everything is truly future proof and we don't need versions because everything's compatible with everything always. But I can't see how any software could get away from version numbers.
I was just going to say, we could kind of follow what the CK editor team has done, which I didn't know until last week when we talked with one of the leaders. CK editor 5 is the current version, but it's a lie because they actually call it CK editor 5, but they've had, I don't know, a dozen major version releases since then. CK editor 5 is currently version 40 or 42 or something like that of their software.
Well, or Mac OS 10, right? 10.1, 10.2, 10.3.
So this is my point, right? Figma, you have no idea what version Figma is on, right?
Well, but these
shouldn't matter to us.
SASs, and you also have no idea what version Chrome is on, but it forces updates on you.
The problem I think we would have as a community, honestly, is how do we make sure that a module is compatible with the version that we're using, or the version we're going to be using?
Ivan's got ideas.
I'm not suggesting we drop versioning. I'm suggesting we stop referring to a version number in the marketing, and that we think about Drupal as a product called Drupal.
Who is we and what is marketing? Right? Like, this is the problem. I had this problem. I talked about this on my podcast years ago. Like, I keep coming in and like, why did they make this decision about this software? This seems stupid. And then over time I realized, why did we make this decision? And what can I do about it? And it's hard to dictate how people talk about software, talk about a project like this, but I think that there's some leadership that you could provide, Yvonne.
Thank you. That's why I asked, why don't we call it? When are we going to stop using the version numbers?
I think the community, I think these are the kinds of things that are community led, but I think this more than other things the association helps with too. Because we had a show recently where we talked to the association, we talked to Batty about the association board. And one of the things that she talked about was, one of the prongs that the association is starting to go to these big conferences and talk about Drupal itself. Like, for example, Drupal didn't have a booth or anybody at SymphonyCon, which the Drupal community is one of the biggest consumers of Symphony. There should be somebody there. So I think these are great questions, and I think as an semi-outsider looking in, I think these are some of the things that Tim Doyle, being an outsider of Drupal coming into the association, is starting to solve, see the fruits of, and they're starting to go to conferences. But I've never thought about. I'm not a marketer though, so I don't think that way. That's fascinating.
When I don't have to sell a Drupal 10 upgrade to the client from Drupal 9, when it's baked into how easy it is to keep the site up to date, when it's baked into the maintenance cost that the client has, that's a win. It's a win for me. It's a win for the client. It's a win for Drupal. And I think we should pat ourselves on the back for what incredible changes we made in Drupal 8 in going to something that is community driven, that is driven by the end of life of frameworks that we know years in advance, that we can plan around. And I honestly think that we're at a point now that we can just start talking about Drupal and let the versions take care of themselves. It's a developer thing. Like, we can just sell Drupal to the client. I've never heard of WordPress being sold by a version number. Have you?
That's interesting, because WordPress.com is a SaaS. Yeah, that's it. That's really interesting. Yvonne at 107.com, folks. He's going to take the lead on this initiative.
I actually considered creating an issue right now in the queue. I'm just not sure where to put the issue. Maybe Nick can help me out, and we'll put that in the show notes. I will create an issue. How's that? Thanks, Jeff.
An issue called Stop Talking About. Yeah.
Stop talking about Drupal versions.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you on. You're welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. I hope I wasn't too disruptive.
Absolutely not. Although this is the first time in a very long time that we've gone over time, so I apologize. I apologize for that.
I take full responsibility.
Yes,
no worries.
Yes, you do.
John actually had a basketball playoff game, so he dropped a little while ago. This has only happened one other time in the podcast, so
Also, can we just clarify? He left because of a basketball playoff of his or of his child's?
His child's.
Okay, so
on
it's
the
not him.
basketball team.
That's okay. Got
Like,
it.
John, go.
John, wow.
Yeah.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
And you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
And get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest host, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for that newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button. All right, as we close out the show, Jeff, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, jjeff.com is kind of my personal site and the central host of my coaching work. jjeff.com is that. And then all the ViibBox stuff that I've been talking about, you can find at spaceage.tv. Yeah, I think those are my main things. You could find links back and forth there and stuff. But yeah, reach out. I'm always excited to talk to people.
And Yvonne, thank you for joining us again for the last 4 weeks. It's been a pleasure having you on. If listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Thanks, Nick. It's been awesome being on the show. Yeah, if people need to get a hold of me, as Jeff said earlier, Yvonne@107.com is the greatest email to use, the best email to use. And then my profile is at 107.com/Yvonne. That's TEN7.com/IVAN.
If you are looking for John, you can find him at Picosi.com, or you can learn more about EPAM at EPAM.com. I think that's his outro. And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
See you guys next week.